Tsarist Russia was fairly similar. They pursued the standard model a little bit more vigorously. They had railways, and Russia did have high tariffs. There's no denying that. And they had a bit more schooling. Like Mexico, they relied on foreign borrowing and foreign direct investment. They got some growth in GDP, but real wages there stagnated too, and they had their revolution in 1917. That was the end of the standard model for them. The last hurrah for the standard model was import substitution industrialization in Latin America, which started before the Second World War, but it's really carried on through the Second World War, where they built a lot of railways since 1913, and used tariffs, finally had universal education after World War II. And so from 1959 to 1980, GDP per head started to grow at almost 3% per year. However, it all failed in Latin America as well. I think the reliance on foreign borrowing made the whole accumulation process a hostage to international financial issues and events, and resulted in the Mexican default in 1981, which stopped growth there. But there's also kind of more fundamental reasons that the standard model didn't work in Latin America, and that's because of the way technology had changed. So the technology of the 1960s was not only more capital intensive than the technology of the 1860s, but the size of efficient factories was much bigger in the 1960s than the 1860s. So all the countries of Latin America set up tariffs and regulations to promote automobile manufacturing, right? And so an example is Argentina, which did this. In the 1960s, the minimum efficient size for a vehicle assembly plant was 200,000 vehicles a year. An engine plant was 1 million vehicles a year. In Argentina, where they required local production, the largest firm only produced 57,000 cars a year. So what their policies did was create a big automobile industry, but one which was, only about a third as efficient as the North American or European industries. So the application of the standard model in Latin America produced an intrinsically inefficient industrial structure, which held back economic growth and wage growth. So it's really important that this was not true in the 19th century. In the USA, for instance, in 1850, the market was 2,000 times bigger than the efficient size of a cotton mill. So they could have gazillions of cotton mills that were all efficient. Same thing is true of the iron industry, right? So that these tariffs in these Western Europe and the USA in the 19th centuries may have hurt consumers by raising the prices they had to pay for goods, but it didn't burden their economies with intrinsically inefficient manufacturing sectors like has happened now. So what about Canada? We have to ask this because all of you have noticed that the standard model sounds like the national policy, right? That and the standard model is applied in Canada, right? And the British North America Act abolishes tariffs between provinces. It creates the legal basis of the national market. There's railway building as part of the national policy, the CPR and then the CNR. Stable banking system is developed. Universal education, broadly based, is a feature of Canadian policy for quite a long time. So Canada does all this stuff too from 1879 onward. So was the standard model more successful in Canada than in Mexico or Russia? And well, certainly the Canadian development trajectory is more satisfactory. I've added this blue line here is what you see for output per worker versus capital per worker for Canada. And this ends in 1990 here. And it doesn't show up very clearly because of all the overlaying of the dots and so forth. But what you see is that the Canadian economy looks very inefficient in 1870. By the 1890s, the level of efficiency is certainly picking up. Whether this is, and to the degree to which this is related to the policy, I'm not going to answer tonight. And then it picks up even more during the Second World War and afterwards. And Canada has a level of efficiency that's sort of 30% higher than the bulk of the countries in that graph. It's interesting that, it's not quite as, its level of efficiency is not quite as high as the US, but it's higher than most of the other countries, certainly higher than countries like Germany. Another feature, another parallel that I want to mention, although I don't want to resolve everything here, is that like Latin America, market size and scale economies have been issues in Canada, right? And in the post-war period, the auto pact initially between Canada and the US was designed intentionally to prevent the kind of Argentine outcome in Canada, right? By creating a much larger market, the aim was to alleviate that constraint that bedeviled Latin America. So this was also an argument that's been advanced for North American free trade in general. One of the things that I noticed in looking at these data is that there has been no productivity catch up with the U.S. since free trade with the U.S. In fact, the U.S. productivity has grown faster. The Canadian productivity has carried on as it has been, but the gap is, if anything, got larger. That's not what you would expect if scale economies were inhibiting the Canadian economy. You would have thought if that was the issue and there was bigger plants were built after these agreements that you'd see a big rise in Canadian productivity vis-a-vis the U.S. You see the reverse. That just shows it there. So to go back to the poor countries here, how can poor countries catch up? What they have to do is grow very fast. So there's a little bit of simple arithmetic here. Not only do the poor countries have to grow fast to reach the level of like Canada today, except it's going to take a while for the poor countries to get there, and by then Canada has moved on, right? So the target's a moving target. So the per capita income grows at about 2% per year in rich countries. Poor countries start off with an income of maybe 25% that of rich countries. If you say we want to catch up in 2 generations, 60 years, that means by the arithmetic of it that per capita income in the poor country has to grow at 4.3% per year, if you calculate it out. And then allowing for population growth, that means that GDP in total has to grow at about 6% per year on average for 60 years to catch up. So has anybody ever done that? Well, there are 10 countries in the late 20th century between 1955 and 2005 that grew at 4.3% per person per year or more for over the 50-year period. And these are the countries. And so it's an interesting list, and we can say, why did they grow so fast? What did they do? So we start off with Oman, Botswana, and Equatorial Guinea. You may not have known that those were successes. But the thing that underlay them all was that in the period, they discovered either oil or diamonds. And so by the end of the period, income was really high, right? So one recipe to get rich is to discover diamonds on a large scale in your country, and you can do it like that, right? I think this is interesting too, because lots of people point to Botswana as an example of a country that's grown really fast because it has good institutions. Nobody points to Equatorial Guinea as an example of a country that grows fast because of its good institutions, right? So I think this is an indicator that it's not in this case the institutions that explain the growth, but the presence of these resources. So they're not very helpful models. So then we have Hong Kong and Singapore, and I don't think they have lessons that are very important either, because they're unique in that they're city-states. So they're self-contained, they're very small, they're one city, and that means they don't have a big agricultural sector behind them. So they don't face any of the issues of the city grows and there's huge immigration of illiterate farmers from the countryside, and what's that going to do, and how's that all going to be absorbed? Nothing there. So I see them as quite unusual. Without the interesting countries are the ones down here: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, China, and the USSR earlier in the century. They were big countries with big agricultural sectors, and they grew really fast. And how did they do it? They've all done it with a kind of big push industrialization based on some kind of planning of investment and in the country, although it's been very different. So the thing is, in order to grow at 6% per year every year for 60 years, all kinds of things have to happen simultaneously that might otherwise happen sequentially. Like all sorts of capacity has to be built before the demand that's going to purchase it. Cities have to be built before the industries and so forth. It all has to happen together if it's going to happen really fast. And the only way for that to happen is if So all the acts of investment require faith that the complementary investments are going to actually occur, and that only can take place if there's some kind of coordination of the investment activity. There's many ways this has happened, and some institutions are better than others. Some ways are better than others, right? The USSR was the first big push industrializer, and it was successful for about 40 or 50 years, but then growth stopped and it was unsuccessful. And some of the things they did that I think were effective were planning, investment, and education, which underpinned their growth. But they adapted a system of industrial organization that proved really detrimental and inefficient, with material balance planning, output targets, soft budget constraints, all sorts of things that locked up resources in inefficient firms and ultimately choked off growth in the country. Japan, which is an interesting, because it had a different system of planning and used it to grow fast. I mean, Japan is often, people talk about Japan as a big success from the Meiji Revolution and Restoration in 1870 up to the Second World War in 1940. And a lot happened, and there was a lot of growth, or there was some growth and a lot of structural change. But actually, over this period, GDP per head in Japan only grew at 2% per year, not 4.3, and compared to 1.5% in the USA. So Japan was slowly closing the gap. But if you take those growth rates and the income levels in 1950, it would have taken Japan 327 years to catch up if they stayed with what they were doing. And that was too long, and that's not what they did. And instead of what they did before, which was figuring out how to adapt and re-engineer foreign technology to meet their factor costs and their low-wage environment, they completely reversed the thing, orchestrated a development boom in which they went for the most capital-intensive, largest-scale investments possible, and in the end, their factor prices adjusted to that rather than the other way around. This required a big market, and the only way they could do it was by exporting to the USA, and a big share of their manufacturing output went there. So the collapse of of American heavy industry in the Midwest was the flip side of the East Asian miracle. And the political question is, why did the Americans let it happen? I mean, for almost 200 years, they prevented that stuff with high tariffs, but they decided at this point that Japan was their bulwark against communism in Asia, so it paid to give up American steel for Japan. China is today, I think, another example of a big push. I know there's a big debate about the role of market reforms versus planning and the way the Chinese economy works, but my take on it is that China uses a lot of planning for heavy industry, transportation, technology, and education. What the Chinese did is take the parts of the Soviet system that worked, which was the investment allocation and planning for heavy industry. They kept that, and they junked the parts that didn't work, all the material balance planning, the output targets. Instead, they introduced profit and cost calculations and markets and so forth. So they were in a position to close down inefficient capacity, which they've done. Well, we can see. Well, the future will tell whether these institutions actually work or not. We'll see. So just to sum up, and the end of my hour, some of the lessons of history, it seems to me, are that Washington consensus policies of free trade and open capital markets have never been followed by large successful countries. Following comparative advantage has led to underdevelopment and not progress. Building up domestic technology capabilities and savings has been more successful than relying on foreign investment. And to catch up to the West, growth has to be very fast for 2 generations, and that requires planning, investment, technology, and education. So, thank you.
This week, Bob has been around the economics department for the first time for a while, hanging out, and I was reminded, I guess bitterly reminded, of how much we lost when Bob was stolen away by Oxford. Bob is always interesting to talk to. His mind is engaged in very original ways in the most important questions that we face. And I'd like you all to join me in thanking him for demonstrating that again this evening.